spoke about, oh, thank you, Daniel, spoke about uh, Strauss and Oppenheimer and the Jewish connections of the two of them. That was a really fascinating two lecture series. It's also on our YouTube archives. So if this is interesting to you and you want to sort of delve in more from a different perspective, Jack's uh, Jack's lectures, probably now 2 summers ago, were just wonderful. And I'd encourage you to revisit those. I also just want to say thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting this work. It is such a thrill to have scholars like Daniel. I'll let you know next week our scholars for the next 2 months. Things are in the works. Always a joy to learn together. And at the end, I'll put a link in the chat. If you haven't yet been able to donate and you'd like to, you can do that just from the link I provide today. Take it away, Daniel.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to class number 2. Let me just spotlight this. Perfect. Okay. So a couple of preliminary remarks, and then there's probably 4 hours of material to get into. So I will attempt to keep it very focused today. This was probably the hardest class to put together. One, because, as we'll soon see, Leo Strauss was just prolific. I mean, he wrote about topics from history to politics to philosophy to Jewish studies and everything in between. He lived about, 80 years, again, the same lifespan of the early 1900s, World War I, the Holocaust, the founding of the State of Israel, sort of postmodern America, American liberalism. So we'll touch on all of that. The second comment that I just wanted to make preliminarily that I kind of want to be festering in the background is this is a series on Jewish thinkers, and there is a debate about whether to contextualize Leo Strauss as a thinker who happened to also be interested in Judaism or a Jewish thinker. And there's actually a very interesting debate about should Leo Strauss be considered as a classical Jewish thinker. Most of his writings did not directly touch upon Judaism, although, as we will soon see, one of his most famous books was about Maimonides and Judah Halevi, which sort of gets into his wider ideas of how to see the world. So many scholars, if you were to just pick up a book on Leo Strauss, don't front the sort of Jewishness. They remark that obviously he was born Jewish. He grew up actually in an Orthodox home. He fled the Nazis in the 1930s. He was actually applied for a position to teach at Hebrew University for interesting political reasons. He was actually turned down, so he ended up coming to America. And so there are some scholars that want to suggest that Leo Strauss sort of had his origins in Judaism and then eventually became sort of much more universalistic. Then there are other scholars, such as Liora Batnitsky, the Jewish studies professor at Harvard, that makes an argument that to really understand Leo Strauss and his worldview, which again we'll get into in a few minutes, you actually have to contextualize it within a Jewish situation. And Leo Strauss essentially makes no sense if one does not understand the Jewish background. So with all of that introduction, let's hop right in. And I will share my screen and we'll do a little bit of a biography and then get into some of the core ideas. So there we go. Okay. So Leo Strauss, and I like usually starting off with interesting, provocative quotes. Leo Strauss often discussed what he called the theological political crisis of modernity. This is obviously a nod to Spinoza's book, The Theological Politicus, right? Where Spinoza attempts to usher in modernity by essentially downgrading the role of revelation or revealed religion in favor of pure reason, right? If we know one thing about Spinoza, I think I might have mentioned Spinoza 2 classes ago, but Spinoza represents a departure in sort of Western history from a religious-centric worldview to a pure philosophic-centric worldview. And for Leo Strauss, this amounted to a big problem. And again, a problem that would become commonplace throughout all of his writings. We'll get into exactly what that problem is in a minute. But for Leo Strauss, modernity / liberalism / the sort of cultural soup that we find ourselves in these days, and these days meaning the 20th century and of course the 21st century, we find ourselves in crisis. But let's unpack that a little bit. He was born in Western Europe in 1899 into an Orthodox Jewish home. At the age of 17, he became a political Zionist, which for those that have come to any classes on Zionism, which I'm going to guess is almost everybody here because I recognize most of the names, being a political Zionist was not a very common move for a German Jew certainly before the 1920s and 1930s, but we'll talk about how his sort of political Zionist awakening connects to his wider political thought. He was also a student of Martin Heidegger, which is also, again, just there's always this question, if we take a step back, if this was a academic class at UCI, I'd probably spend 30 minutes on this next sentence of what I'm about to say. I'll spare you guys, but there's always a very interesting debate of how much do you accept thinkers' ideas as sort of purely detached from their biography, and how much do you try to explain the ideas that people given their biography. And in other words, do you try to understand, these massive thinkers given the context of their history and what the circumstances are and perhaps political events and any wars that were going on? Or can you take somebody's ideas and sort of neatly dissect them out of any history? So that is an interesting debate in the background. And one such, I think, fascinating bullet point is Martin Heidegger was perhaps the most important German philosopher of the 20th century. He's been called by many of his students, including Leo Strauss, as the smartest person he has ever met. So Leo Strauss had very fine words for Martin Heidegger's intellect. And yet, in the 1930s, Heidegger actually joined the Nazis, and he was a Nazi sympathizer. And he not only did he not do anything to sort of criticize the Nazis intellectually, he actually joined on a number of Nazi intellectual projects. And this, for Leo Strauss, would later on constitute a crisis of, well, how can this be? How can the smartest philosopher, the most, from his point of view, the most reasonable and rational person he's ever met, become a Nazi? And this is, again, going to be part and parcel of his wider diagnosis of essentially what's wrong with the world. So I mentioned before, in the 1930s, he flees the Nazis and comes to America. And today he is known for being one of the most influential political philosophers of the 20th century. And there's sort of no political science class or program that doesn't in some ways run through Leo Strauss. He spent most of his career at the University of Chicago. And again, just, he is famous for essentially redeeming the role of the classics within political philosophy. And so we'll see again how all these ideas connect, and we'll come back to this in about 45 minutes. But one of Strauss's lasting legacies is endlessly defending the need for the classic texts, right? So we think, Aristotle and Plato, and even for him, some of the Islamic thinkers, Averroes, Ibn Sina, Farabi, and then, of course, in the Jewish sense, Maimonides. He is an endless defender of the need to continuously go back to these ancient texts. And again, we'll see why. And just because I had mentioned this book before, his most famous Jewish book is a book called Persecution and the Art of Writing. And this is where he talks about Maimonides and Judah Halevi. And again, we'll unpack all of these in a minute. And his major question that's going to run through his entirety of his writing is trying to ask the same question that he believes pre-modern philosophy was trying to get at, which is, how does one live a good life? How does one organize society? What does it mean to be good, right? All of these sort of vague but bird's eye questions that if you read ancient writers, they're constantly trying to get at. Strauss wanted to bring these questions back into the field of political science. And he was very critical of what he called the modern social sciences, because he thought that modern social sciences avoids the deepest questions. And so he has a lot of writing about, modern field of political science. And he says, political scientists have gotten very good at sort of measuring sort of where the voters are at and what inflection points are going to be and everything there. But they've approached this from a morally neutral position, or what he calls historicism. In other words, a position that says that, well, any view can potentially be true, and who knows what truth is. And again, we'll get to this in a minute. We'll connect all these ideas at the end. But because of this, Strauss is perhaps best known for his critique of liberalism, critique of modern liberalism. Again, it doesn't mean that he was not a liberal, but he was very critical of modern liberalism. And just the last thing that I'll say is, many people here may be familiar with the famous myth of Plato's cave, where in Plato, he imagines a group of people that have been spending their entire life living in a cave and just seeing shadows, and them thinking that the shadows represent the real world. And it's only once they can be released from their shackles that they finally realize that this, they've been seeing shadows their whole life, and they come to this higher truth. And so there's been many interpretations of the story in Plato's cave, but Strauss said that in modernity, we actually inhabit a cave underneath the cave, right? In other words, we are so far removed from the truth because there are so many things distracting us, such as technology and wider tribal movements, that we are so far removed from truth that it's going to take a lot of effort to get us back to sort of the core truth of the world. This is sort of a bird's eye view biography of Strauss, and now let's dig into some of his ideas. So one of the ideas in Strauss, and this will hopefully get us into a conversation of both his views of important Jewish thinkers such as Maimonides. Strauss did a lot of writing on Maimonides, and he's perhaps, at least in Jewish circles, he's most well known for a series of hypotheses that he has about specifically Maimonides, which, again, even within that is a debate. But Strauss compares two different types of thinker, right? And again, I had mentioned in a previous class that all good theorists try to make dichotomies or dialectics. And so for Strauss, he compares what he believes to be the person of Socrates to the person of Plato. And we'll see how this is relevant to our wider thesis in a second. But for Socrates, as the philosopher, Socrates wants to question everything. So if you're a philosopher, there's nothing that's out of bounds for questioning, right? If there's religion or beliefs or laws, right? The role of a philosopher is in some way is you don't care essentially what you knock down. You are going after truth. So it doesn't make a difference how many people you offend. It doesn't make a difference if you are going against the rules and the laws of the city or the state that you're in. You want to follow truth no matter where it takes you. And again, the idea, right, for a philosopher that you accept something because of tradition is anathema to the project of philosophy, right? If I believe something because it is tradition or because everybody else says it or because some authority told me, I am not a philosopher. And again, we can think of the sort of philosopher as representing a pure intellectual freedom. And Socrates, we know, was put to death, right? He was put to death in a public trial for his views for being a heretic. And for this, Spinoza had a diagnosis of Socrates that philosophy, and we'll get into this a little bit, but that modern, that what he calls the city, right? And the city is humanity, right? Society, civilization, right? Any grouping of people, right? We can think of this as Jewish community. We can think of it as the United States of America, right? Whatever we conceptualize as our group of people, the city cannot handle pure philosophers because the role of a pure philosopher is to never accept anything at face value. You'll see how this is clear when we compare it to Plato. Plato he considers a politician, or what he calls the political philosopher. And the difference between a philosopher and a politician or a political philosopher is that political philosophers understand that in order to have a functioning society or civilization, there needs to be some things that are accepted just because of tradition or accepted beliefs or shared stories that we have among ourselves. And a political philosopher, right, who's a wise, politician, understands that if you allow for too much pure philosophy, that can threaten society, right? It can threaten people's civic cohesion. And again, the politician is endlessly trying to reconcile both politics and philosophy. And again, for Strauss, this is a very difficult thing to do because in some sense, these two things are contrary to each other, right? You have the idea of philosophy, which constantly is trying to get you at truth. And you have the idea of politics, which is about the organization of large groups of people. And these two things can often come into conflict because there are times where it is easier or perhaps more useful or perhaps the only way to actually organize large groups of people is to have certain ideas that everybody in the group accepts, and we don't have every single person in the society endlessly going back and saying, well, why do we do this? Why do we do this? Right? In other words, to have a functioning city or civilization or tradition, right? We can think of Judaism in a second, and he'll make a connection to Judaism in his later writings. You need some ideas that are accepted because that's just the way it is, essentially, instead of constantly spending your whole life going back and re-questioning anything. And so again, a political philosopher is not just interested in the pure truth, but how do you reconcile truth with the needs of the population? So again, philosopher seeks truth, political philosopher asks how a society can come into contact with truth. And for Strauss, the important thing is that any budding civilization demands this conflict or tension between what he calls philosophy and the city. And so the goal of leaders and thinkers is not to go all in on either one of these. Again, for Strauss, again, like many thinkers, I feel like I say this every single class, the role of tension, right, between two different ideas is very central in their thinking. And for Strauss, the tension between Socrates and Plato, or the city and reason, or other times he writes this as Athens and Jerusalem, right? You need to constantly be oscillating between this tension, because if you go too far to either side, right, disaster happens. And we'll see how this goes into his political thought in a second. One more just sort of example on this, and here is where he gets to his major commentary on Maimonides. So Strauss, given, of course, his obsession with Socrates, has this insight, which is that there are certain times in history, and for Strauss, it's going to be most times in history, where if you had radical ideas, you couldn't just say them, right? You had to be smart, and you had to shroud your ideas in traditional writing, right? This is one of Strauss's main theses, and even in a lot of literary analysis circles, there's even a term called Straussian reading, a Straussian way to read texts, which essentially is reading a text not for what it says at face value, but for what you can glean from certain ideas, or perhaps if there are contradictions that are riddled within the text. For Strauss, a contradiction is not really a contradiction. It is getting at some deeper truth, right? And if this sounds very Talmudic, the answer is yes, right? This is where you can see some of Strauss's early upbringings. And again, Leora Batnitsky, the Harvard scholar who studies Leo Strauss, for her, this is very much Strauss's Jewish upbringing going into his wider diagnosis of ideas. And so Strauss writes as follows, just to see a quote for how he unpacks this. He says, "Persecution then gives rise to a peculiar technique of writing, and therewith to a particular type of literature, in which the truth about all crucial things is presented exclusively between the lines. That literature is addressed not to all readers, but to trustworthy and intelligent readers only. It has all the advantages of private communication without having its greatest disadvantage, that it reaches only the writer's acquaintances. It has all the advantages of public communication without having its greatest disadvantage, capital punishment to the writer." And so for Strauss, whenever you're presented with traditional texts, so this is true in Plato and Aristotle, this is also true in Jewish thinkers, such as Judah Halevi and Maimonides. We'll get into Maimonides explicitly in a second. One needs to be constantly wary of not just what are these writers saying, but what are they trying to say without explicitly saying it. So this represents, again, this is one such example of the tension between the philosophy and the city. Because if we think about it, right, just to unpack these ideas, and one of the reasons why I had mentioned at the beginning, 15 minutes ago, that this was the hardest class to put together, is Strauss wrote dozens of books, and his ideas are cryptic and enigmatic, and his writing is dense. And so even trying to put together these slides was sort of a editorial disaster that I had over the weekend. And so if any ideas aren't clear, please ask me to elaborate and explain. But one way to think of this, of what writers have done throughout history between what he calls exoteric and esoteric writing. Again, exoteric, right? The prefix exo means external, right? And so exoteric writing is writing that everybody can understand, right? Writing for the masses, right? In other words, if I write a book, what do I want the average person to take away from reading this book? That is in distinction to esoteric, right? Eso meaning internal, right? Something that's esoteric, right? Just the English definition of esoteric is cryptic and shrouded in mystery and unable to be easily deciphered. And for him, the great writers are able to have simultaneously an external meaning and an internal meaning that only very wise interlocutors can tease out. And for Strauss, this was a perfect representation of this philosophy between reason and the city, because the masses can get one idea from a text, that won't contradict order, but the sort of wise reader, right, the Straussian reader, right, the philosopher, can read certain ideas out of texts that aren't explicitly stated, but you can intuit as the writer's main point. And again, this is going to be a key distinction that he's going to make later. And for Strauss, this is the fundamental tension of human society is between the city and philosophy. And Strauss's most important, at least narrow contribution to Jewish thought, arguably his thinking about Judaism goes far beyond just a commentary on Maimonides. But Strauss writes a famous essay on Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed. And for Strauss, the point of Maimonides is to show that both philosophy and the Bible are in endless tension. Now, this is strange because if one reads the Guide to the Perplexed, and I think we've discussed the Guide to the Perplexed, in many different forums at the Jewish Collaborative over the years, Maimonides sets out at the beginning of his magnum opus Guide to the Perplexed to say that he is going to be able to reconcile Aristotle and the Bible and revealed religion versus philosophy. And so Maimonides' stated goal, right? And again, this is the difference between exoteric and esoteric. Maimonides' stated goal is that there is no conflict between Judaism and philosophy, that one can be a Jew and one can rest assured, right? You can rest assured and sleep well at night knowing that Aristotle and Plato, and, if we think about this in the modern context, science and evolution does not contradict Judaism. What the careful reader, at least Leo Strauss points out, will note, is Maimonides does not solve this contradiction. Maimonides actually sort of unearths this contradiction, and by the time the careful reader is done with Maimonides, one realizes that actually it's impossible to reconcile Aristotle and the Bible or the philosophy versus the city, right? These two things are fundamentally irreconcilable. And for Maimonides, and for Leo Strauss, this is actually a positive because for society, and again, for Maimonides in particular, it's not about one winning out over the other, but it's about keeping these ideas in tension. And one example that Strauss gives of Maimonides, again, we can probably spend all of class just on how Strauss reads Maimonides, but Strauss highlights this very peculiar line in Maimonides, where Maimonides is attempting to disprove Aristotle's theory that the universe had existed for all of eternity. Just a little bit of background on here. This is our medieval Jewish philosophy 101. The accepted status quo scientific view in the medieval period, this is going back to Aristotle, is that the universe was not created, the universe had existed forever. And this was obviously a problem for, religious Jews, because the beginning of the Torah is God created the earth. And so, which is it, right? Has the universe always existed, or did God create the earth? So virtually all Jewish writers, starting with Saadia Gaon and Judah Halevi, right? You can think of all the famous medieval Jewish thinkers, defend what they call creation ex nihilo, right? In other words, of course creation happened, and of course God created the world, and Aristotle's wrong, right? It's a tenet of Jewish faith that the universe was created. For Maimonides, he has a very strange chapter on this, where he seems to entertain the idea that Aristotle might be right. Then he entertains the idea that the Torah might be right. And then he ends with the following. He said, he ultimately concludes that Aristotle has no proof. And so because it's two things that have no proof, we should default and accept Jewish tradition. But then he says, if on the other hand, Aristotle had a proof for his theory, the whole teaching of the law would be rejected and we should be forced to other opinions. So he says, well, if Aristotle had a proof, this is a problem because this would make the entirety of the Torah, right, what he calls the law, completely irrelevant. For Strauss, this was one clue, right? Strauss has many clues, but for Strauss, this was one clue that what Maimonides is actually worried about is the fact that he seemed to actually agree with Aristotle, and he did believe the universe was here forever and not created. Again, if this is two in the grains, we'll come back out to our bird's eye view in a second, but just to get back to Maimonides for a second, Maimonides, according to Strauss, actually did agree with Aristotle that the universe had existed forever, but Maimonides understood that if that was true, then the law or the city or Jewish society would collapse, And so therefore he had to reject it, not for a philosophic reason, but for a political reason. In other words, Maimonides, for Leo Strauss, is doing the exact thing that we were talking about Plato doing, which is Maimonides is not a pure philosopher. Maimonides is the political philosopher or the politician, whereas he's constantly managing this dialectic or this tension between what is true and what does the community actually need in order to survive and thrive. And Strauss teases this out in one of his most famous essays, which is Jerusalem and Athens. And then I'll pause for a couple of questions because I know this is again I had said this 30 minutes ago, and I'll say this again. This is the by far the most dense class in terms of ideas. So I very much apologize. I didn't even realize how far down the rabbit hole went until I was preparing last week. But hopefully we can make some sense of this at the end. It'll all sort of, I think, loop up in a nice bow at the end. But Strauss unpacks these ideas in an essay called Jerusalem and Athens. And in it, he sets up, again, a classic dichotomy. Before I go there, Rhea, did you have a question? I think you're on mute. There we go.
Sorry. Okay. So it's about Socrates that he actually, he was condemned to death, but at that time, the jailhouse door was always open. He could just walk out to freedom. And his friends, according to the conversation that was recorded, that I think Socrates recorded, that they said, just walk out. You don't have to take the poison. And because Socrates believed so much in the state, in the existence of the state and the state being the right, that he took the poison. So it's a lot more complicated, and it's has to do with the individual versus the state. And so I would assume that Strauss would have delved into something of that nature. Did he?
Yeah, so I think it's Plato's dialogue. It's called Crito, which deals with this conversation of Socrates and his friends. And you're right. I think Strauss would say that that is Socrates endlessly doubling it down on the philosophy. In other words, if he thinks something is true, he is going to go at it no matter how many negative side effects there are on the way, in this case, including his own death. So I think this would fit his wider thesis. But you're right. It's not, again, oftentimes when you kind of create queer ideal types on both sides, you end up oversimplifying both. And I think great thinkers recognize this. Again, we talked 2 weeks ago about Gershom Scholem's idea of, mysticism versus tradition. And then we talked about Yeshayahu Lebowitz's distinction between nature and God, or, idolatry and God. And I think all these thinkers, if pushed, would admit, you're right, these two different types are a lot more complicated than we think. They set it up because I think it's useful to think about ideas through these very pure categories. But I think you're right on the actual biographical details there. And so yes, great point. So Strauss is going to write an essay called Jerusalem and Athens. And for those that are familiar with the two categories, Jerusalem and Athens have, for the last 200 or 300 years, been used as, again, just abstract categories to talk about the conflict between revelation versus philosophy, or science versus religion, right? Athens, of course, representing the capital of the ancient Greek world, right? That's where you have Aristotle and Plato and the rise of philosophy, versus Jerusalem, which obviously represents revelation, revealed religion, Judaism, and not just Judaism, right? Christianity, and then later on Islam as well. And so Jerusalem and Athens are sort of these, well-worn categories. And for Strauss, he's going to write an essay, and ultimately he's going to conclude society needs both Jerusalem and Athens. And if society doesn't have either of these, that society is going to collapse. For Strauss, revelation is important because revelation is the only thing that can ground ethics and morality. And again, this sounds like a very common critique of that religious types have towards secular types, which is there's no grounding of ethics and morality once you step outside the confines of religion. And for Strauss, this was an enormously important thing to preserve. Now, there is a meta question that I was actually asking myself all weekend, and I have not been able to come up with a good answer. So if anybody has thoughts, I would love to hear them in about 10 minutes when we get to these ideas. But at this point, Strauss was not a traditionally religious person, right? I had mentioned before that he grew up Orthodox, but even in his teenage years, he kind of thrusted off Orthodox practice again when he became a political Zionist. For the vast majority of political Zionists early on, that was mutually exclusive with being a religious Jew. In other words, making the decision to become a Zionist at the age of 17 was synonymous with the decision to say, I am no longer going to be a religious Jew. And in generally, it came with a, type of atheistic outlook, right? And one can read, right, the original political Zionist writers, and we've talked about this many times before in this forum, that for political Zionism, they actually viewed Judaism as, or Jewish religion, not Jewish civilization, but religious Judaism as an impediment to the Zionist project. And I think I've mentioned this poem before, but one can read Bialik's poem in 1903 and about the pogroms in Eastern Europe. And Bialik explicitly states that there are sort of two types of Jews. One type is the strong Zionist type who has realized that they have to protect themselves. And in the diaspora, you have the Jews with trembling knees who are sitting around about to get killed. And instead of protecting themselves, they're praying to God, God, please save us, right? And so for political Zionists, right, they did not look kindly upon religion. And so for Strauss to defend the need for revelation, it's unclear if this is what Strauss actually believed, right, in terms of his philosophy, or what Strauss thought was a important belief for organizing society, right? Because Strauss is very in tune at separating the two, and Strauss never actually writes what he personally believes. So again, that is sort of one meta question to put aside there. And again, the problem with Strauss and the reason why this was probably 5 times harder than any other class that I've done putting together, is Strauss's entire thesis of reading older writers is that they write things that they purposely do not agree with for the masses, and then they have a secret message that's encoded within it that's for the careful reader. So then when the careful reader tries to read Strauss, it's very hard to figure out, well, what is he, right? Am I one of the, commoners that's reading this? Or am I one of the, people that can understand these esoteric writings? And you're constantly questioning yourself and you're not really sure. So that's a little bit of why, this is so hard to put together. And this essay, I think, more than any other essay, that comes at play. For Strauss, revelation is what grounds morality. For philosophy, that is a critical inquiry. And in this essay, he says that a civilization is healthy when there is a constant dialectic between the two, right? Philosophy keeps religion in check because it's very important for people not to become dogmatic religious fanatics, right? So it's very good that there is constantly that philosophic inquiry in the mind of anybody who's religious, thinking perhaps you don't have the only truth that's accessible in human history, and perhaps other people that might disagree with you have a point, right? They're not all these, idiotic, immoral people, right? For Strauss, that was very important. But also on the flip side, for Strauss, when philosophy trusts itself too much, there is a danger that philosophy gets detached from any ethical concern. And again, for Strauss, being a product of the Weimar Republic and subsequently Nazi Germany, Strauss is going to be very critical of what pure philosophy or pure scientificism, right, or sciencism, right, focusing just on human rationality. For Strauss, this is actually what creates Nazi Germany. And we'll get to this in a second because there's a couple more building blocks. And for Strauss, even the way that he talks about Judaism, right, he has this paragraph about Moses, where he says that even Moses, right, Moshe was not a philosopher. Moshe was a political leader, right? The goal of revelation, right, the goal of the Torah and Judaism is actually not at getting what are these pure truths that we can prove through analytical reason. The goal of Judaism is what he calls chesed and rachamim, right, or chesed v'rachamim. In other words, ethical concerns, right, obligation for the weak and the downtrodden and the orphan and the widow, right, all these things that the Torah, has, riddled throughout. I think 36 times in the Torah it says, make sure to care for the stranger, right? For you were once strangers in the land of Egypt. For Strauss, this is the core tenet of revelation. and that revelation and philosophy are not contradicting each other. They're operating in different axes, right? So you could think of religion as operating on a moral dimension and philosophy as operating on a capital T truth dimension. And when you don't have one of these, things go very bad in society. And for Strauss, the reason why modernity is in how I started this, a theological political crisis, is because these two categories have now been collapsed, right? He has a long legacy of how this collapsed. He actually starts to blame a little bit of Thomas Aquinas, because he says in the medieval Christian period, there was an attempt to take philosophy and sweep it under the category of revelation. In other words, what Thomas Aquinas attempts to do is say, philosophy is actually just a subcategory of revelation. Unlike, again, the way that Strauss reads Maimonides, where Maimonides is very careful to keep these two categories separate. So again, even the way Strauss is understanding Jewish tradition is that great Jewish thinkers, such as Maimonides, he also writes this about Judah Halevi, right, the medieval Spanish poet and philosopher who wrote the Kuzari. For Strauss, Judaism has always recognized you need to have a balance between revelation and philosophy, or ethics and science, or ideas for the masses, or ideas for the careful esoteric reader. But for Strauss, once these two categories collapsed, the modern field of philosophy, and by philosophy he really means the academy or society in general, not just a bunch of philosophers sitting in a room somewhere. The modern society does not take revelation seriously. And once revelation is not taken seriously, in other words, religion is no longer taken as a serious intellectual concern within society. And for Strauss, this is a problem, because for Strauss, revelation, and especially the ethical obligations that revelation gives upon people. In other words, right, what do I get in terms of ethics when I read the Torah? That all humans are created in the image of God. That I have a obligation to care for other beings. That there are things that are objectively wrong because they are, they lead to worse societies. For Strauss, once modernity thrusts off religion and says, religion's just a bunch of, fairy tales and myths, right? This is his criticism of Spinoza, right? Once Spinoza says, well, nobody should believe the Torah anyway, right? It's sort of this outdated theology. Philosophy becomes too sure of itself, right? For Strauss, this is what happened in the modern period. But the problem is philosophy actually cannot answer these wider questions, and philosophy internally implodes. And then all normativity is lost. In other words, all modern philosophy and modern society loses the ability to actually point out basic truths of what is right and what is wrong. And you get a sort of Wild West, where on the one hand you can have, postmodernism, where there's nothing that's really true and everybody has their own truth. On the other hand, you might have a type of nihilism. In other words, if nothing is true, who cares what happens to anybody, right? There's no difference anyway. And for Strauss, this is represented when these two categories fall apart. And this obviously brings in disaster, right? It brings in Nazi Germany. He also did a lot of writing on the Soviet Union, right? So for Strauss, right, I think there was a poet who said this. It wasn't Strauss, but I'm forgetting. I think it was a Russian poet. Somebody might know here. They said, I walked through modernity and I followed it to the end, and all I found was gulags and gas chambers. And so for Strauss, this is the problem with modernity, is that once this very delicate balance in a society is lost, philosophy becomes too sure of itself, and there are no longer any checks and balances. How does this relate to the Jewish community? Because at Strauss was living through, obviously, one of the most tumultuous times in Jewish history. Again, Weimar Republic, Nazi Germany, founding of the State of Israel, all of these big ideas. And Strauss was around at a time when Jewish writers, both in Western Europe and also in America, right? If we think of people like Louis Brandeis, were obsessed with this question of the Jewish problem, or the Jewish question, right? This goes back to the 1800s and it's something we've talked about many times before. I think we did a whole series on Zionism, or we did a whole series on modern Jewish thought about 6 months ago. And so the entire modern Jewish thought essentially is trying to answer this question. But the Jewish problem is, how do you fit Jews into modern liberal society, right? In other words, how do you, what is the relationship between Jews and the state? right? Are Jews a religion that happens to be, you can be a French man and a Jew, and there's no contradiction there because your nationality is French and your religion is Judaism? Or is Judaism actually a nationality, in which case, to be a French Jew or a Jewish Frenchman, there actually is a conflict there between your allegiances to one state or the other. And if that is true, right, this is from the point of view of French, French writers, why should we fully accept Jews as French, given that the Jews do not fully ally themselves and acknowledge themselves to be Frenchmen, right? So there's about 200 years of writing in the Jewish community trying to answer these questions. And for Strauss, the point of this question is that it is unanswerable, right? Everyone else tries to give answers to this question. Here's what Strauss writes about this. He writes, to realize that the Jewish problem is insoluble means ever to bear in mind the truth proclaimed by Zionism regarding the limitations of liberalism. Liberalism stands or falls by the distinctions between state and society, or by the recognition of a private sphere, protected by the law, but impervious to the law, with the understanding that, above all, religion as particular religion belongs to the private sphere. I'll unpack this in a second when we see the end of the quote. Just as certainly as liberal states will not discriminate against its Jewish citizens, so it is constitutionally unable and even unwilling to prevent discrimination against Jews by individuals or groups. To recognize a private sphere in the sense indicated means to permit private discrimination, to protect it, and thus, in fact, to foster it. The liberal state cannot provide a solution to the Jewish problem, for such a solution would require a legal prohibition against every kind of discrimination, i.e., the abolition of the private sphere, the denial of the difference between state and society, the destruction of the liberal state. In other words, right, we're sort of almost full circle. We're 300 degrees now, right? Just to unpack and connect all these ideas. For Strauss, liberalism, right, capital L liberalism, is in some way one of the conclusions that you get when societies stop worrying about what is objectively true and, right, follow philosophy to the natural conclusion, right? For Strauss, if you follow philosophy to the natural, and here's where Strauss is a very troubling thinker, because many of us have a knee-jerk desire to sort of tell Strauss, no, you can't be right, but these questions continue to foster, right? Let me explain before people have the knee-jerk reaction of what I'm saying can't possibly be true. For Strauss, if you follow philosophy down its natural conclusion, you get to liberalism, right? What's wrong with liberalism, according to Strauss? Liberalism suggests that the public sphere is philosophically and morally neutral. In other words, the state is not going to tell Shirley or Sylvia or myself what we should be doing or thinking, right? I can be the best person ever, or I can be the worst person ever. As long as I'm not infringing on people's rights, the state cannot tell me my belief is good or bad, right? That's the role of the private sphere, right, within liberalism. The problem then for Strauss is if society is a net ethically neutral, right? And here he critiques, right, academia, right? He's certainly looking at, right, people like Martin Heidegger, right, as well. But this is even true in the American sense. If the political sphere is net neutral, then inevitably there's going to be private groups that are going to hold very discriminatory views, right? Racism, right? But in this case, right, anti-Semitism. And the state is actually unable to do anything to root out this discrimination against Jews. And so anti-Semitism is always going to fester. And so this is, again, why he says the truth proclaimed by Zionism regarding the limitations of liberalism. In other words, Zionism and the political Zionists were incredibly critical of the liberalism of Eastern Europe at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s. And again, Strauss becomes a Zionist during the time period of the Weimar Republic, which was actually quite culturally and socially and politically progressive and quite liberal in terms of capital L. And Strauss, right, even from a young age, had this understanding of, well, when the state stops thinking about revelation or how or what is true, right, what the best, right, what is ethically right, not just what is philosophically and in a pure reason sense right, the state becomes neutral, right, liberal, and liberalism actually allows for really awful views to fester because there's nothing in the liberal toolkit that can stop people from having abhorrent views. And so in some way, again, not explicitly, but he blames the liberalism of the Weimar Republic in some way for the rise of the Nazis. Not to say that the Nazis were liberal, of course, they were anything but liberal, but for Strauss, when the public sphere is devoid of any ethical normativity, right, for this type of postmodernism or nihilism, in other words, well, who are we to impose truth on anyone else, right? Nobody knows what true is, so the public sphere should stay neutral. That is going to allow the hardest of views, right, the most extreme views to actually fester because there's nothing stopping them. And so for Strauss, this was in some way the problem of modernity as well. We'll get to this in one second, but just to drive this point home. So Strauss, in much of his work, and then we'll get to some more of his Jewish legacy in a second, is going to call for a return to what he calls the endless tension between philosophy and revelation. In other words, for Strauss, and I mentioned at the beginning that one of the things that Strauss was known for is trying to reclaim the centrality of the classics within the education system, right? So again, Aristotle, Plato, the medieval writers, because for Strauss, the medieval writers spent all of their time thinking about this tension in a way that didn't collapse it, right? You read Aristotle and Plato or Maimonides or Judah Halevi or even, medieval Islamic thinkers, and throughout their writings, there's a tension of how to balance ideas of what's good for everybody and ideas of what is actually true, ideas of ethical norms and ideas of what he calls philosophic or scientific norms. And again, without this distinction, philosophy becomes so sure of itself that it can't contain itself, it implodes, and then you're left with, again, the rise of discrimination against, again, here it's not just Jews, right? For Strauss, the Jewish problem was the universal problem of liberalism. Again, the failure of liberalism to actually say what is right and what is wrong in some authoritative way. It's not surprising, right? One of Strauss's legacies, this is not Strauss himself, but many students of Strauss, I'll point out, essentially founded the neoconservative movement. So if we're thinking of Strauss's effect on internal politics in America, right? Strauss was probably politically a liberal, right? Despite all this criticism, but Strauss gave rise to neoconservatives. Again, the neocons were and are known for wanting to export democracy, right? So again, this idea that America, right? This idea that very much is anti-ethical relativism, right? And the idea that, no, America and our way of doing it is actually better in some sense. We should try to spread democracy to other places in the world. So many of the people that were at the forefront of that movement were actually students of Strauss. And again, you can kind of see how they tease that out from his writing. I want to talk about just one or two more ideas before we close today, because Strauss actually gave a lecture at the University of Chicago Hillel sometime in the 60s. And the lecture was called Why We Remain Jews. This is, again, after Strauss had become quite popular and quite prolific already, and he was coming to speak to a group of college students. Again, obviously, because of my role at Hillel, I found this, very interesting, just in terms of historic tidbit. But Strauss is going to give two reasons for why Jews should remain Jews in the modern world. The first is perhaps not the most optimistic reason, but his first reason is that there's no other choice, right? In other words, for Strauss, the world will not let Jews stop being Jews. And he writes, I begin again, there is no solution to the Jewish problem. The expectation of such a solution is due to the premise that every problem can be solved. There was a famous writer, a great mathematician in the 16th century, as I read somewhere, Vieta, who literally said that there is no problem which cannot be solved. This is, in application to social matters, a premise of many well-meaning men in the West and 19th in the 19th and 20th centuries. I disagree with them entirely. It is not self-evident that every problem can be solved, and therefore we should not be altogether surprised if the Jewish problem cannot be solved. So Strauss is saying two things. One, he's saying, right, again, what I said on the last slide, the Jewish problem is here forever, right? Jews, there's never going to be a neat fitting in between the Jewish community and the wider public in the diaspora, right? In capital L liberal societies. Again, it's something that, many Jews, that aren't in Israel, which I'm going to guess is everybody here, right, lots of us have sort of had this knee-jerk feeling in the last couple of years of, how is there still so much anti-Semitism? How has this not gone away? This is crazy, right? Anti-Semitism should have gone away, I mean, hundreds of years ago, but, certainly it should have gone away 60 or 70 years ago. How is it possible that there are so many, political and social forces that are still against the Jewish community? For Strauss, this was not this would not have shocked him at all, right? He thought that this was, right, an unsolvable problem or an insoluble problem, as we said on the last slide. But Strauss is saying something else. He's also saying that utopias don't exist, right? He's saying that in the 19th and 20th century, there were people who tried to solve the problem of humanity, right? Solving world hunger or solving world peace. And again, for Strauss, this is another example of philosophy becoming too sure of itself, right? You had all these movements, right? Nazism and communism could be two such movements where they are based in some sense on, right, not science necessarily, but a type of scientism that accepts certain premises about rationality and science and attempts to take it to the logical extreme, right? For Strauss, it's no coincidence that the Nazis were obsessed with science, right? The word racism, right? Here's just one example. The word racism, right? Today it's bad to be a racist, right? You should not be happy if someone calls you a racist. Being a racist was a respectable scientific position if you were in the late 1800s, early 1900s in certain Western European academies, right? It was the same as if I said I'm a chemist or biologist, right? I study the scientific study of chemicals, right? What's wrong with that? A racist was, well, I study the scientific categories of race. What's wrong with that? And if it then turns out that some races are better or worse according to some scientific or philosophic ideas, well, then what's wrong with trying to tilt society away from one group and towards another, right? So for Strauss, you can very easily see how a overly confident conviction in philosophy or science without any ethical concerns can quickly, produce Nazism. Again, we can do the similar thing for, communism and other types of totalitarianism. And for Strauss, again, the point is, societies need to constantly be living in this tension. So then he says, well, if Jews cannot stop being Jews, we should at least be Jews with honor and pride. But then at the end of his essay, he says something else, which is that the place of Jews in the world is to show the world that the world has not yet been redeemed. In other words, that the world is not perfect. And here he writes as follows. This is towards the end of his speech. He says, Judaism is not a misfortune, right? Because then he has to walk it back, right? In other words, if your speech to a bunch of college students is you have to be Jewish because anti-Semites won't let you assimilate, that's probably not the most optimistic way to leave it. So then he ends his speech as follows. He says, Judaism is not a misfortune, but let us say a heroic delusion. In what does this delusion consist? The one thing needful is righteousness or charity. In Judaism, these are the same. This notion of the one thing needful is not defensible if the world is not the creation of the just and loving God, the holy God. The root of injustice and uncharitableness, which abounds, is not in God, but in the free acts of his creatures, in sin. The Jewish people and their fate are the living witness for the absence of redemption. This, one could say, is the meaning of the chosen people. The Jews are chosen to prove the absence of redemption. In other words, the Jewish role in the world is to help maintain this balance between revelation and reason. And the Jews are the constant example, right? Oftentimes, right, it for bad reason. A lot of times it is in some sense a misfortune because it leads to so much hatred of Jews. But in another sense, Jews, the role of the Jewish people is to continuously drive home the idea that there is God, God's created the world, and given that, right, we need to act in justice and or righteousness and charity. And these are not things, according to Strauss, that are defensible from any rational perspective. Again, there's no rational reason, according to Strauss, why I should give some of my hard-earned money to somebody who needs it. There's a revelation reason. There's a Jewish reason. There's a godly reason. And once this collapses, again, you're left with everything we discussed before. And the role of the Jewish people is to constantly ensure this dynamic. And he has another line at the end where he says, any Jew who reads about the Crusades, this is enough reason to remain a Jew. And this can have two reasons. This can have two understandings to it. One is this beginning. In other words, many Jews have suffered for us to be here right now, right? Who am I in the 21st century in a nice, comfortable apartment in Irvine to say I'm going to stop being Jewish when 800 years ago, my great, grandparents were willing to sacrifice their lives for being Jews, right? So that's one way to think about it. The other is in a world where human beings are capable of doing things as grotesque as the Crusades, the world needs the Jewish contribution more than ever, which is continually telling people question your ways in which you're organizing society and your convictions, right? You need to constantly be engaging in this tension or dialectic between ethics and truth, or city and philosophy, and that the role of the Jewish people is again to ensure that this balance is ever there. And so, just to end, this is sort of a little review of before, but just the last slide, just to talk about this core idea, and then we can hopefully wrap it all up. Is Strauss writes as follows, and I think this is sort of indicative of his thinking in general. He says, finite relative problems can be solved, infinite absolute problems cannot be solved. In other words, human beings will never create a society which is free from contradictions. From every point of view, it looks as if the Jewish people were the chosen people, at least in the sense that the Jewish problem is the most manifest symbol of the human problem, insofar as it is a social or political problem. In other words, for Strauss, this all goes full circle, right? And again, if you're a little bit confused about what Strauss actually believes about Judaism / revelation / all of this, in some sense, that was the point that I was making before, right? We're sort of left with, and I'll unshare my screen just to highlight this. It is unclear, right, if for Strauss the principles of religion were true in a philosophic sense, or they were just what he calls, right, sort of a noble lie, like or a necessary belief in terms of a political foundation, or whether or not he actually believed it with conviction. But for Strauss, the role of Judaism and the Jewish people, going all the way back to medieval Jewish writers such as Maimonides, is to ensure that this tension is constantly around, and again to ask us the question. Again, Strauss does a much better job at asking questions than answering it, right? I guess that makes him also a Jewish thinker. And for Strauss, the entirety of liberalism or postmodernism, right, is something that constantly demands a question of where are we actually basing our wider values? Where do we actually get our truth claims? Are we counting the role of sort of ethical and moral behavior here? Because if not, again, it's a very slippery slope for Strauss. So I know that this was very dense. Again, I said at the outset, this was definitely the hardest class to put together, and we probably could have gone for many more hours. But I would love to hear, any and all questions or thoughts. Ray, go for it.
Okay, so I have a couple things. One of it is the Jewish problem, the concept of the Jewish problem. It's not a Jewish problem; it's a Christian problem. That if you read, you may have read Constantine's Sword, and that embedded within Christianity is the anti-Jewish hatred, and then that racism is not a scientific concept, that it's a social construction. And we are vertebrates, we are mammalia, but as far as the color of our skin or the shape of our nose has nothing to do with categories within what the human species is. So it is not scientific. And so that's what I have to say, my polemics.
Yes. In terms of the racism, you're totally correct philosophically. That is not that is probably not the answer you would have gotten in 1920s in a liberal institution in Western Europe. And I think that was more of Strauss's point. Strauss would have agreed with you, of course, I think philosophically there. Your first question, in terms of the Jewish problem being a Christian problem, I think probably what Strauss would say is, I mean, just the historic record of, on the one hand, of course, meaning, right, okay, one, we can sort of unpack it, right? Even pre-Christian, ancient Greek culture was anti-Jewish in a way, right? It wasn't the sort of unique focus on Jews, but one can read, Greek writers from the second third century BCE that spoke about Jews as sort of misanthropic people that do all sorts of weird things and won't just assimilate. Obviously, Christianity sort of ramped this up to a much, much, more extreme level throughout, the third, fourth century, as you mentioned before, with Constantine and Augustine, and also the medieval record there as well. But I think for Strauss, once this forms into modern nation states, the problem with liberalism is that liberalism, again, just doesn't take any position. So it doesn't really matter where the anti-Semitism is coming from, right, or what its basis is. The liberal state actually cannot protect vulnerable groups such as Jews because doing it would actually be illiberal, right? And in a lot of ways, right, one can sort of clearly see this, right? I'll give a very explicit example. I was in Hungary last summer, and there are a lot of Jews in Hungary, right? It's become a very popular Jewish area. Tons of Israelis everywhere. And we were in Budapest and for the week. And so, I'm obviously inquisitive and nosy. So every time I saw, other Jews on the streets, and I would ask them, do you live here? Are you visiting? Do you feel comfortable wearing a kippah? And in Europe, in the last couple of years, in the vast majority of European countries, Jews do not go around in public wearing kippot or anything Jewish. The year before I was in Barcelona for Shabbat, and the rabbi, this was very Orthodox, Sephardic synagogue, came up to me after shul because he didn't recognize me and said, "Make sure not to wear your kippah once you leave." And that's a pretty crazy thing to hear from a rabbi, when you're leaving synagogue. In Hungary, all the Jews were wearing their kippah, and it turns out that they're all big fans of Viktor Orban, right? He just lost in his election a few weeks ago, but right, Jews loved Viktor Orban there. Orban, right, was not liberal, right? He was illiberal, right? He ushered in many illiberal reforms. On the other hand, the tension that Strauss would have us look at is the illiberalism of Orban actually allowed him to crack down on the anti-Semitism a lot easier than liberal states, because if you're in an illiberal state, if the illiberalism, right, depending on where it's firing, Orban could actually arrest people for, saying certain things about Jews, again, contrary to liberalism. And so Strauss is not saying we should all go out and vote for Viktor Orban, right? He's not saying that. And again, probably he was a Democrat and a liberal, but Strauss is saying that this is an inherent tension within liberalism of liberalism will actually, right, there isn't actually a utopian solution in liberalism, right? It's not that we just need 30 more years of liberalism and then Jews will be safe, right? And again, he lives through the Weimar Republic and the collapse and Nazi Germany. And so, he probably had a lot of baggage that, we don't have to agree with him, obviously. But in terms of his diagnosis, right, it's the reason why for him, he became a political Zionist, the reason why he became very critical of liberalism is for this exact distinction. So, I just thought, I was reading a lot about that because obviously Orban lost after, what was it, 2 decades of rule last week.
So, Daniel, I want to say, my dad has a question, but of course, but I just want to say that exactly what you're describing, I think, is very helpful to me in understanding why more traditional Jews in the United States feel much more comfortable in the a certain kind of the Republican Party at this point. Not, you know what I'm saying? It's just a fascinating, that if you look at how people at Beth Jacob and Chabad vote versus other congregations in our area, I think there's a piece of what you're saying, if not exactly what you're saying about Hungary right here in the United States. Dad, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I have a comment that I think the tension is manifested in great deal, or in great part, over the issue of the Messiah, and that Christ is the Messiah, and the Jews deny that, and that in and of itself breeds some of the anti-Semitism. And I think it's simply in that irreconcilable view of things when we approach the issue of the Messiah.
What do you think about that, Daniel?
Yeah. I think in some way, I think this even goes back to Yeshayahu Lebowitz from last week. And I think Strauss would actually agree with this idea of Lebowitz, where he wrote, just a reminder if people weren't there, Lebowitz has this famous line that Messiah is a false Messiah. In other words, Messianism is an orientation, not an end goal. And again, Strauss was very critical of utopian solutions because for Strauss, right? Strauss was right. Strauss thought this couldn't be solved. In other words, Strauss is not saying, therefore, we should have a king who strips everybody of their private freedoms in a totalitarian state. In some way, what Strauss is saying is, in order, and this gets back to the Viktor Orban comment, and maybe even Trump in America. It's very easy to imagine a political system with no anti-Semitism. It would be totalitarianism to have a totalitarian leader who was not anti-Semitic. The question is, would we want to live in that society? The answer is probably no. And so for Strauss, this is the entire tension there of, if you want liberalism that actually, right, and it's not just, I mean, there were many philosophers who sort of understood the crisis of liberalism similarly, is that liberalism, because of its distinction between private and public, has to allow for all sorts of ideas as sort of a net neutral. In other words, right, in America, liberals, right, I'm not talking about Democrats or Republicans or progressives, but capital L liberals, right, both on the right and the left historically, applaud the Supreme Court, actually argued by many Jewish lawyers, allowing Nazis to march in Skokie, right, in the 1960s, right? The neo-Nazi march went right by, one of the most densely populated Jewish neighborhoods in the country. And for liberals, this is actually a great victory of liberalism and free speech. That amazing, the Nazis, had, just as much as I have a right to go out and say, I like, olives on my pizza and not pineapple, the Nazis have a right to say, it's a shame that all the Jews weren't killed. And for Strauss, this is just a problem. It's not a problem that has a solution, but it was a problem that's worth thinking about in critical ways. And perhaps, again, one of his projects, I think, of wanting to return to the classics is he thought that they actually did a good job thinking about all of these different tensions. And again, like most good thinkers, the goal is not to solve these tensions, but it's when you stop thinking about the tension, that's when really bad things can happen, because then you have no other view to sort of, get you off your, roller coaster, right? If society is going down one path very quickly, then that could very quickly go into radicalism if you don't have another view that's sort of a backstop to it. So, yeah, thank you, everybody. This is a lot of fun. David Hartman next week will be a little bit easier to digest in terms of many of his views. He was not nearly as dense and technical of a writer as Leo Strauss. So he talked a lot about the modern state of Israel and ensuring that Israel does not lose its commitment to traditional Jewish values, right? Not religious, right? So he was not arguing for a theocracy, but Hartman's big contribution was to ensure that that Israel does not lose sight of Jewish values and it doesn't just become reduced to a political state like all other states. And so in a lot of ways, he actually very much disagrees with Yeshayahu Lebowitz's understanding of what Israel should be, where for Hartman, Israel is, after thousands of years, Jews finally have an opportunity to create a model society that actually, gives a lot of our debates in history meaning and value. And just one example, because I know the time is running short, is much of Jewish texts, right, from the Talmud on, deal with cases over the public sphere, right? Civil cases, what happens if my ox gores, Marsha's ox leaving the supermarket. And this is all well and good, but this is all theoretical, because when Judaism was relegated to, again, a private religion, if my ox gores Marsha's ox, we're not going to a rabbi, we're going to the, Orange County court to figure it out, or probably we'd be able to do it without the court, hopefully. But for David Hartman, right, now that Jews have a state, well, finally we have all this material and ideas and wisdom of how to run a society. Will Israel actually live up to the test of doing this? And in some ways he was very critical of much of Israel's policy. In a lot of ways he was sort of a cheerleader for ensuring an injection of Jewish values into Israeli society. And the one example maybe we'll this next Monday is the Hartman Institute, which he founded, was actually one of the main writers of the IDF Code of Ethics, which is just a fascinating text that blends Jewish traditional ideas about just war and also modern pragmatism. But thank you, everybody, and thank you, Rabbi Marsha.
Yes, great class. And and by the way, he would also probably say that he was not a religious Zionist, even though he was religious and a Zionist. I mean, I'd love to talk about that too. Just I love that distinction. And anyway, Thanks, Daniel. Great.
Yes. Thank
See
you
you
all.
next week, everybody. Take care. Bye.